Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing arms sales, and specifically in the context of Israel. Both arms sales to Israel, and this is then more on the part of the UK government, and secondly then arms sales from Israel, secretive arms sales in fact, to many countries around the world, especially those who are engaged very, actively in violating human rights, and especially those countries who are in fact under military embargo by the UN or others around the world. Now, the Israeli Supreme Court has at this point in time decided that it will not accept the petition that had been put forth by an Israeli lawyer, as well as a number of activists who were asking for details, the secretive details of those weapon sales of Israel to, as I mentioned, many of those countries under military embargo around the world. Secondly, then we have the UK Minister of State for the Middle East and North Africa region, James Cleverly, who is breaking, in fact, UK ministerial code by refusing to answer basic questions on UK arms exports to Israel. And we know very clearly that within the UK ministerial code, that requires ministers to be, quote unquote, as open as possible with Parliament when it comes to such affairs. Of course, not just limited to arms exports. So let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Samuel Perlo-Freeman, who is the research coordinator of the Campaign Against Arms Trade. He's joining us today from Birmingham. Also joining us from Birmingham is Kamel, who is the chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And joining us from Jerusalem is Jeff Halper, who is director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Jeff, Kamel, and Sam, thank you to all three of you for taking your time out this Saturday to join us. Sam, let me start with you, and let's start firstly at the top, and that is the Israeli Supreme Court itself. And I wanted to get your thoughts. I know you're sitting in the UK, but I want to get your thoughts about this, that how important is transparency overall when it comes to such arms exports, especially then to countries probably that are under military embargo?
Very important. Of course, arms exports, they're not like trade in any other product. They are, some of the most lethal equipment that's sold. And yet, worldwide, there is far less transparency on arms exports, on exactly what is being sold to whom and for how much, than on most other products. And Israel, in fact, of the major arms exporters, is one of the least transparent, along with countries like Russia and China. They produce one press release a year, maybe, saying the total value of Israeli arms exports, which amount to about $8 billion a year on average in recent years, with maybe a little detail on proportion in different regions of the world. But that's all. Nothing about what's being sold, nothing about to whom, how much, nothing about how they're going about deciding and the consequences for conflict and human rights abuses. And so all the information that does exist on Israeli arms exports has to be dug up from NGOs or when companies themselves or customers choose to release the information. So it's a very, very poor picture for transparency.
Kamel, is this, do you think, for the Israelis, do you think arms exports and sales are actually like almost a form of diplomacy for the Israelis to an extent? Because, we know that the Israelis still very much, I believe, export arms to the Myanmar junta, for example. And in the past, of course, there was many questions about their relations with the apartheid government in South Africa as well.
I mean, first of all, let's not forget that Israel adopts a policy of non-transparency about its nuclear weapons. So it isn't surprising that it's very secretive about its weapons exports. And that figure of $8 billion is a huge figure. So in fact, then the question is, what are these arms used for when they are sold? And I know we'll come to the UK a little bit later. But the question is, are you supplying it to repressive regimes? Is it simply a case of dollars that you count and you say we've made these sales? And in Israel's case in particular, it very proudly, or its manufacturers proudly say the weapons are battle tested. Battle tested, that means in very clear terms on the Palestinian people, whether it's drones, whether it's bombs, everything that Israel produces can come under that when it comes to dropping bombs on Gaza. And the other thing is it is used, the arms industry also includes the spying industry, whereby the software is sold to countries with poor human rights record, potentially, that then use them to spy on people, bring them in, and that might result in their incarceration or death. So it does seem to be very untransparent, but it doesn't surprise us, because when it comes to weapons, whether nuclear or otherwise, Israel is not very transparent, as you rightly said. One press release a year. We have to remember that weapons kill.
Indeed, and Jeff, correctly, as Kamel there said, this is not a surprise, but then at the same time, this has very, very real world effects, be it ripple effects or on the ground, right? So, for example, Israel's relations with the Myanmar junta, I mentioned that because, of course, we know what's happened in Myanmar vis-a-vis the Rohingya, and even after the coup, the suppression that is taking place in that country. Why would Israel want to align itself in this fashion with those sorts of governments?
Well, Israel doesn't only align itself. Israel has arms exports all over the world, even to countries that it has no military relations with or diplomatic relations with. Israel uses, you asked the question about, the relationship of arms to diplomacy. Israel has what I call a security politics. In other words, the way it keeps its international standing throughout the world is by its arms sales. And by arms, I don't only mean the major military weapon systems and so on and technologies, but also surveillance systems. Glasgow has just ordered an urban surveillance system from Israel, police training, all kinds of what I call technologies of repression. In other words, Israel has a wide range of security, military, policing equipment that it sells, and it does so because then that's how it gets. They say money has no smell. That's how it gets the support of every international government, including governments that don't support it. So with Myanmar, for example, just as an example, it isn't Myanmar that's important. Who's supporting Myanmar? And Israel has very, very close relations, obviously, to China. So, it's true that it's not transparent. But if you begin to trace the threads, and the threads are there, and you begin to understand how Israel uses its arms exports in a diplomatic sense in order to get away with having an occupation and oppressing the Palestinians, then you begin to understand the logic behind supporting governments, not necessarily supporting repressive regimes, but supporting the governments behind the repressive regimes that support them. So, it's a very complex picture, but a very clear one in that Israel is using its arms exports for diplomatic reasons.
Sam, let me bring the UK into the conversation as well, because, of course, as we know, James Cleverly, and I'm sure you know this story very, very well, has refused to answer these very basic questions about arms exports to Israel from the UK then, right? So, I wonder, this is almost like a give and take relationship, because something that Jeff there mentioned, right, is also police training. So, for example, we know that, and I would think possibly this is the same case in Britain and the UK, that a lot of American police also, in fact, are trained in Israel. So, for example, we had that as an issue during the Black Lives Matter protests in the US as well, where heavy-handed tactics were being used that were, in fact, because of the training of Israel for many of these police officers. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I'm not sure, to be honest, about police training in the UK, but certainly the Israeli arms industry, especially Elbit Systems, is an important supplier to the UK Ministry of Defence. They were one of the main contractors for the UK's Watchkeeper UAV program, and Elbit Systems UK, with its various subsidiaries, continues to produce a wide range of equipment for the MOD, as well as for export back to Israel and to and to many other countries. So there is certainly a very close relationship between the UK MOD and the UK arms industry and the Israeli arms industry. And of course, the UK is a significant supplier as well of arms to Israel. The F-35 stealth fighters, which Israel used in Gaza for the first time in May, although they're US supplied, 15% of the value of every single F-35, including the one sold to Israel, is made in the UK.
So then, Kamel, why isn't there more uproar about this? I mean, if you have such a lack of transparency, even on the part then of the UK, for example, this I would have thought that would have raised many questions in Britain's minds, that they should be reacting and saying, listen, we want to know what these arms exports are, A, and how they're going to be used by Israel or anybody else, in fact, that the UK would export to.
No, I think that campaigning organizations like the PSC and the Campaign Against the Arms Trades continue to raise these very significant concerns about arms sales to Israel. And, for example, in the Labour Party under the former leader Jeremy Corbyn, there was the Labour conference decided that it would have a review of arms sales to Israel and indeed to other oppressive regimes, not just to Israel. So I think people continue to raise this. We'll be raising this again in Parliament on the 8th of July when we have a lobby of Parliament. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign has a lobby of Parliament then. So people do. But the interesting thing is the response from ministers. And it isn't, by the way, just James Cleverly. He is the current Minister for the Middle East, and he's the person who has evaded answering the questions. But even when they do, the standard answer is that the UK works on the basis of a risk assessment. In other words, if a country wants to buy some weapons, there's a risk assessment of whether or not the weapons could potentially be used to oppress in oppression, in the case of Israel, to oppress Palestinians. And then at the end of it, if they're satisfied that there is no risk of that weapons are issued. So in fact, over the last few years, there have been many questions to ministers asking that question. Can they tell us if weapons have been used against the Palestinians? And I recall in 2018, for example, on the day that something like 60 Palestinians were killed at the Gaza fence with Israel, a question was put to Alistair Burt, then the minister, and he responded with exactly this answer, that we're very careful in how we sell weapons abroad. We carry out a risk assessment, but what we don't do is to follow that up to check whether after the sale they've been used against people. Well, that's interesting because I teach risk management, and one of the things you do is you learn from your mistakes. In other words, you investigate to see whether they were used and then bring it back into the risk management framework, and you say, actually, Israel might be using these against the Palestinians, so we shouldn't sell them arms. It actually is straightforward in that sense.
Jeff, I wanted to go back to a point that you made earlier, and that is money, right? And that's an argument that one can make for any country really around the world that exports arms, that there is so much money in the arms industry right now that it's really hard to put this back into the box, right? Is it the same case, do you think, when it comes to Israel? I mean, is it the same as, for example, Germany exporting arms or the US exporting arms, where the industry in those respective countries is so large and there's so many people working within those respective industries that to try to control it then would mean the loss of many jobs and the loss of a lot of profit?
Well, I mean, money is a big factor, but also the technology involved. Well, we have to understand, you can't isolate the arms industry from the wider industries that a country has. So you have what are called the dual-use technologies. So, the same GPS systems that you have in your phone are the GPS systems that guide what are called smart bombs. So you can't separate military technology from technology in general. And if Israel is known as a startup nation, and it's very proud of all its biomedical technologies and its nanotechnologies, and you have the Haifa, the Technion in Haifa, or the Rehovot Institute of Science, that are worldwide centers for investment and for involvement in all kinds of international initiatives in science, including in the United States, of course, in Europe, in China, and in key places like that. The arms industry is just a piece of that. In other words, the technologies that are developed in general. And the arms industry is a trigger for that kind of development because it has a lot of money to invest. The arms sales generate a lot of money. And then you reinvest that, not just the money part of it, but the manpower, the knowledge, the technologies back into your economy in general and become a kind of a startup nation. So we have to really understand that the arms industry is only one, but a crucial part of a country's larger economy, and that's certainly the case for Israel, which is partly the startup nation status as a part of its way of legitimizing it in the world of technologies, in order to partly to cover the military part of it, but also if you're in those circles, to emphasize that it's because of our military prowess that we're so good at these other technological areas.
Sam, in a post-Brexit context, and I don't want to overstate this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm understanding this incorrectly in the UK context, but in the post-Brexit context, there was always this talk about the UK needing to ensure that its economy is not hurt, and so it was reaching out to everybody for trade deals and to ensure that, even arms sales, I would think, are an extremely important industry in the UK as well. So do you think that this sort of thing, and I'm not talking specifically about Israel only, but just arms sales in general from the UK, that possibly the government will loosen even more of the standards so that that industry does not get hurt, and then that essentially then just means that money is winning over human rights?
Money is winning over human rights, but the UK was under successive governments continuing to export with very little restraint when it came to the major customers. But the economic importance of the arms trade for countries like Britain, it's rather more important in Israel, which is a much more militarized society, as Jeff said. The economic importance is drastically overstated. Arms exports account for about 0.2% of UK employment. It's really tiny. Its importance is more seen strategically in terms of it's viewed as an absolutely key industry for supporting a country's sort of military capabilities and military autonomy. It's also sometimes seen as a diplomatic tool, though how important that is again something that can be overstated. But in pure economic terms, while of course the companies make huge profits, compared to the overall economy, it is really fairly tiny. It's more the sort of strategic, political, military, industrial interests that you've got to look at rather than how many jobs are involved.
Very well. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. We really, really appreciate Sam, Kamel, and Jeff for the context that they brought to this conversation and the clarifications that they've given myself and I'm sure the viewers as well. Really important discussion, right, about arms sales. The issue of arms sales anyway around the world is always an important one and seemingly is perpetually not transparent by many governments, especially the Western governments who are exporting these arms. But in the context of Israel as well, it possibly is a tool of its diplomacy and outreach and ensuring that it does get support when it so needs it in international bodies such as the United Nations and otherwise. And secrecy then is extremely important in those regards so that it is not called out for supporting any regimes, so to speak, around the world that are under military embargo. And then the UK as a democracy, as one that would see itself as above all others when it comes to transparency and moral authority in these regards, is also then proving to be quite secretive when it comes to its arms exports to Israel. So what does that then say about what kind of a weapon or instrument, in fact, this may be for the UK as well going forward vis-a-vis arms sales, be it to Israel or any other country around the world? A really important discussion to have. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss an issue which has been long-standing, at least of recent, over the past number of months. We've increasingly in Canada found a number of mass graves of Indigenous children. And these graves are being found on sites where residential schools once stood. And for those of us on the outside of Canada, residential school system was a network of mandatory boarding schools. In fact, during the 1870s, even all the way to the 1990s, in fact. The last residential school was closed in 1996, as far as I'm aware. And these were mandatory because what would be done was they would remove Indigenous children from their families and their culture and seek to assimilate them into then the Canadian, quote-unquote, culture of Canada. And so now we're finding all these mass graves. It's more than just taking away the culture then of course, Indigenous children and communities, but is in fact, it resulted in the deaths of many of these children because of the abuse and possible torture that they possibly suffered in those schools as well. And these are just, of course, one of the many issues that Indigenous communities across North America and in many other parts of the world have suffered at the hands of their colonial powers. Let's discuss those issues and others. We're now joined by Dr. Crystal Fraser, who is an assistant professor of history and native studies at the University of Alberta. She's joining us this morning from Edmonton, Alberta. Joining us from Saskatoon and Saskatchewan is Dr. Dwight Newman, who is a professor of law and the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Rights at the University of Saskatchewan. Dwight and Crystal, good morning to you both, and thank you both for joining us. Crystal, I'd like to start with you. As the weeks continue to go by, we continue to find more and more of these graves. How do you reflect on that? It seems that even Canadians, myself included, we continue to be shocked every time these graves come up because it just shocks the conscience, I guess.
For sure. Thank you for those questions. And so we really need to be reframing how it is that we talk about this system. And so they were formerly called Indian residential schools. Historians have known for a long time that this was a system of genocide. And Indigenous families have also known for decades that they have had missing children who never returned from these institutions. And the institutionalization of children at residential schools was legislated under the Indian Act of 1876. If parents refused to send their children or hid their children, they could be imprisoned or fined. And so for sure in your comments, you mentioned that a lot of Canadians are shocked. Indigenous peoples are not. We've known for a really long time that our relatives and our ancestors have been missing, and now is finally the time where we're able to pour resources into these efforts to find them.
Right. So Dwight, through the shock then, of course, a lot of politicians have made all the right kinds of statements. I don't want to overstate that, but they've made all the right kinds of statements. But will that be enough? What needs to actually happen vis-a-vis action then now?
Well, I guess the question is this a big wake-up moment for the Canadian public generally? Because as Dr. Fraser has said, there wasn't a secret about this exactly. Communities knew about missing children and missing ancestors. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, now a number of years back, had written about this exact sort of thing. And in some ways, it seemed like Canadians were paying attention to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, or TRC report. There have been actions in response to it. But the shock that a lot of Canadians seem to be experiencing in the wake of this shows they didn't pay attention to every aspect of the TRC report. And this now is a very tangible sign, though, in terms of when Canadians see these mass graves being discovered, it just brings it home, one can hope, in a lot of ways, that people can really imagine or have the empathy to feel what it's like to have a child removed and never come back. And in terms of the actions to come, there are going to be a whole range of things. And we just have to see what does happen this time. But Canada just having entered into a legislative commitment to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and a process for an action plan around that really really opens up a time now where there could be legislative changes on a lot of different things to better respect Indigenous peoples in Canada. And there may be specific responses to this particular situation that are appropriate in terms of memorializing. And a lot of Canadians were reflecting on this even on Canada Day, and I think that's a positive thing.
Indeed, and I'm glad you mentioned Canada Day there, Dwight, because Crystal, I wanted to ask you that, and I know this is just symbolic, obviously, but do you think it was important that a lot of Canadians did choose not to celebrate, quote-unquote, Canada Day in a traditional sense this year, especially in the wake of the discovery of these mass graves? Is that then a glass half full, then possibly approach then to what is to come then, that the public pressure will grow on politicians then to do the right thing?
For sure. I mean, I think the fact that Canada Day was more thoughtful, it was more subdued, is not a bad thing. You know, this past week I've said that when your neighbors are having a funeral, you do not throw a giant party. That would be very inappropriate. But I also think that we've missed a big part of the conversation here. We have went from deep mourning and tragedy and basically moved directly into reconciliation efforts. And my question is, where is the accountability? You know, is Canada going to be tried in some international law? Who were these missionaries and teachers and RCMP who worked at these institutions and who supported genocide in removing their children from families to bring them to these schools? And so I want to know how these children died. I want to know what is going to happen. And so I think there's a lot of important questions to be asking here. One of them might be around Canada Day. And indeed, it was celebrated a lot of different ways this year, sometimes outright canceled. Sometimes you see orange marches. Orange, of course, represents every child matters. And so the fact that it was more thoughtful, more reflective, or all out canceled was a good thing. And we know that more announcements like this are going to come in the future.
You know, Dwight, especially on the outside, right? So when we look from the outside in at countries like Canada and how they're dealing with this, with their respective history of colonialism, and in this case specifically Canada towards the Indigenous, and then these children as well, how important is, as Crystal there mentioned, an accountability instead of just jumping to the next step of reconciliation, because it's also about then that precedent that you're setting for the rest of the countries that are colonial powers, A, and B, what message are you sending to the rest of the world as well?
Right, and I mean, each country with a colonial history is going to have to grapple with that in different ways, and accountability may be an important part of that in lots of instances. Sometimes there have been decisions to move on from accountability. The original Truth and Reconciliation Commission report in South Africa, in some ways, made some tragic choices, not in the sense that they were wrong to do it, but just that it was tragic they had to make those decisions where they skipped over some accountability. I think in Canada we're seeing a strong view that there should be some accountability, but it's a challenge just what form that takes. And I mean, the TRC report certainly provides a foundation for further historical uncovering and for exposing what was done. Whether it's possible to carry out trials or something in that nature has more complexities, unfortunately, just given the distance in time to some of what went on. But of course, as you referenced at the outset, the residential school system continued in a more limited form, surprisingly late, up into the 1990s. And it's very possible that there could be direct accountability for some of the later phases of it, especially. And that's something that I think Canada is going to be wrestling with in the time ahead.
Crystal, whenever there's talk about accountability in this sense, and even just calling out these sorts of atrocities, and I'm talking more generally across many colonial powers, including Canada, of course, there's always in that narrative on the opposing side that says you're attacking us, then you're attacking the countries as they stand today. What do you make of that accusation, if that's the right term? Is this an attack on Canada, for example, to call for accountability or justice, to not, for example, celebrate Canada Day?
For sure. And this kind of rhetoric, we have heard from the Conservative leader, Aaron O'Toole, that activists are attempting to rip down this country. I can assure everyone that that is not the case, that, it now sounds cliche, but we have this phrase, truth before reconciliation, and we still have not found the truth. And speaking of colonial histories, particularly in Canada, I've already referenced the Indian Act. We also had starvation policies on the Western Plains. We have the relocation of Inuit families, the 60s scoop, the institutionalization at Indian sanatoria and psychiatric institutions, often where many Indigenous women were sterilized. And so we have this really long history that Canadians don't have a great idea about. And as educators and as historians, we have clearly failed in some way. And so on our end, we need to be better engaging. We need to be persistent. We need to be lobbying our politicians to get this incorporated into school curriculum. And so I don't perceive it as attacking the country at all. I see it as learning very valuable lessons about the past, but also I encourage people to take this moment of discomfort, because this is what it is things are finally uncomfortable, and this is when change happens. Look at contemporary Canada. Start to understand how these colonial forces are ongoing through the child welfare system, and how we can have conversations now about white supremacy and how we can make things actually better for the next generation.
Dwight, do you think it's time now possibly for the international community to get involved as a neutral actor, I'm saying in this regard? So vis-a-vis a proper investigation, a neutral across-the-board investigation about what atrocities the Indigenous peoples in Canada, the US, and in many other countries around the world suffered during these many, many years, and still, mind you, continue to suffer, I know. So, is that important for for there to be an international aspect to this as well? Because, a lot of these countries say that we can police ourselves. Is that the case?
Well, whether an international component would be beneficial is an interesting question. I think Canada would be capable of putting together some type of an investigation internally that would involve Indigenous participation in that along with others, and did that in some ways through the TRC, but obviously there's more to be done in terms of investigating more. And there have sometimes been models on TRCs that did have an international component in it or around investigations. Whether Canada needs that or not, that's a conversation probably to be had as between those that have concerns with this. And so there's that element. And as Dr. Fraser says, there's also work to be done for the future. And in terms of dealing with the child welfare system and its horrible impacts on Indigenous children, dealing with over-criminalization issues in relation to, or over-incarceration issues in relation to Indigenous citizens, dealing with the ongoing constraints of the Indian Act. There are big conversations to be had there, and those are some of the very important conversations we had, along with those with reference to the past, those with reference to the future.
Crystal, the reason I keep bringing up the international community is because, and I don't want to overstate this, but if this had happened, or these discoveries had happened in a developing country, right, in a third world country, as we name them, then you would have, one would imagine the uproar on the part of the international community would be a lot more, and there'd be a call for the international community to be involved immediately in a neutral way to investigate this, and then to come up with a plan on how to reconcile the situation, have accountability, justice, etc. The the image of Canada and many of these other colonial powers is that they are better than the rest of us. And of course, in many ways, they possibly are. But still, I mean, do you think that there is a role for the international community to play to ensure that, hey, listen, a precedent is set that we need to learn from this properly and have accountability?
Yeah, that's a very important question. I definitely think this is an opportunity that we need to harness, that we need to deeply think about, because when I think about the justice system in Canada, you know, as I've already mentioned, RCMP and settler policing units were involved in kidnapping these children to take them to Indian residential schools. So should they be a part of the investigation? I also look at, you know, the acquittal of Gerald Stanley around the Colton Boushie death. Various examples in Canadian law structures that would suggest that perhaps we do need help and that we're not able to look at this objectively. And in, you know, contemporary politics, I look at the Trudeau government, who ran hard on these ideas of reconciliation. Yet, you know, the firing of Jody Wilson-Raybould, an Indigenous woman, we have the purchase of a pipeline, all other kinds of things that are happening in this country under the banner of so-called reconciliation. And so I think this is the perfect time to be looking outwards to our international communities.
And I'll give you the final word then, Dwight, before letting both of you go. How much of a turning point do you think this will be? Because, I mean, we had spoken at the outset of this conversation as well that it's possible, I think, to overstate that as well, because we just don't know how quickly within this news cycle this will remain in everyone's minds.
Indeed, I mean, that's the question, is just does this get Canadians really paying attention on a sustained basis? I think we have to hope that it does, just because it has been a shock to a lot of Canadians. I also think, tragically, it's not about to end right now. We're going to see more and more of these types of grave sites identified. Some provinces are already entering into processes to help support the findings of these sites, and there's going to be work ahead on them that's going to remain in the news in some capacity. But how much it leads to sustained change on issues that can sometimes be complex, even though they're urgent and pressing, that's going to be the big question. And there's no easy way to predict that, unfortunately.
Indeed. Leave it there at that, but we really appreciate both Dwight and Crystal for taking their time out this morning, speaking to us respectively from Edmonton and Saskatoon. They were able to provide a lot of information, which I think a lot of us on the outside of Canada especially do not realize about Canada, as well as many of these other colonial powers. We have this certain image constructed in our mind about these countries, and we don't realize that their histories and even their present, in fact, treatment of many of these Indigenous peoples leaves a lot to be desired. I mean, there's that question of their moral authority then in the world to be, you know, scolding anybody else for anything else when they themselves are not then able to genuinely be held accountable, be it by the international community or themselves. And, you know, saying that you can police yourself when it comes to finding children who either were killed, tortured, or just died at the hands of a very brutal Indian residential school system, mandatory boarding school, where these children were removed from their parents, their culture, etc. To say that you can police yourself in that regard when you know that there are a number of people who disagree with just Canada going in front of an international court possibly, that again is troubling. So we need the international community involved possibly. We need proper accountability, as Crystal there said as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.